Good evening. Please leave the light on. We shall lie in wait for the creature it is best not to name. Where do we watch for such beings? In the wilds of Transylvania, or the cobbled streets of Old Whitby, or even across the ocean? Perhaps they are our neighbours, living just over the road, stranger and more dangerous than we ever imagined. There was only one person in the village who had actually known Luella Miller. She had never married and had lived alone for years in a house across the road from Luella Miller's. According to this woman, Luella Miller had been a beauty of a type rather unusual in New England. She had glimmering lengths of straight, fair hair, which she wore softly looped round a long, lovely face. She had blue eyes full of soft pleading, little slender clinging hands, and a wonderful grace of motion and attitude. Luella Miller used to sit in a way nobody else could if they sat up and studied a week of Sundays, said Lydia Anderson, and it was a sight to see her walk. She had a green shot silk she used to wear, too. That was what she came out bride in when she married Erastus Miller. Erastus Miller was good-looking, too. Erastus just about worshipped her. I used to know him pretty well. He lived next door to me, and we went to school together. Folks used to say he was waiting on me, but he wasn't. I never thought he was, except once or twice when he said things that some girls might have suspected meant something. That was before Luella came here. I don't know what made Erastus Miller go into consumption of the blood the year after he was married. Consumption wasn't in his family. He worked terrible hard till the last, trying to save up a little to leave Luella. He fell on the kitchen floor while he was getting breakfast. He always got the breakfast and let Luella lay abed. He did all the sweeping and the washing and the ironing and most of the cooking. She didn't even do her sewing. She said it made her shoulder ache to sew, and poor Erastus's sister Lily used to do all her sewing. Lily Miller made all Luella's wedding outfit and that green silk dress after Maria Babbitt cut it. Maria, she cut it for nothing. And she did a lot more cutting and fitting for nothing for Luella, too. Lily Miller went to live with Luella after Erastus died. She went to live with Luella right away after the funeral. This Lily Miller had been hardly past her first youth and a most robust and blooming woman. It was not 6 months after she had taken up her residence with her sister-in-law that her rosy colour faded. The way Lily Miller used to talk about Luella was enough to make you mad and enough to make you cry, said Lydia Anderson. She'd say poor Luella had an awful time taking care of her and doing the work. She wasn't strong enough to do anything, when all the time Luella wasn't lifting her finger, and poor Lily didn't get any care except what the neighbors gave her, and Luella ate up everything that was carried in for Lily. I had it real straight that she did. Luella used to just sit and cry and do nothing. She did act real fond of Lily, and she pined away considerable, too. There were those that thought she'd go into a decline herself. But after Lily died, her aunt, Abby Mixter, came, and then Luella picked up and grew as fat and rosy as ever. But poor Aunt Abby began to droop just the way Lily had. And I guess somebody wrote to her married daughter, Mrs. Sam Abbott, who lived in Barr, for she wrote her mother that she must leave right away, but Aunt Abby wouldn't go. Finally she came, and when she saw how bad her mother looked, she broke down and cried and all but went on her knees to have her come away. She spoke her mind out to Luella, too. She told her that she'd thank her to leave her mother alone. Luella went into hysterics, and Aunt Abby was so frightened that she called me after her daughter went. When I got there was Luella laughing and crying all together, and Aunt Abby trying to hush her. "For the land's sakes, Mrs. Mixter," says I, "you look worse than she does. You ain't fit to be up out of your bed." "I'm well enough," says she. "Don't you think she'd better have the doctor, Miss Anderson?" "The doctor," says I think you need him much worse than some folks I could mention. And I looked right straight at Luella Miller, laughing and crying and going on as if she was the center of all creation. All the time she was acting so, seemed as if she was too sick to sense anything. She was keeping a sharp lookout as to how we took it out of the corner of one eye. I see her. You could never cheat me about Luella Miller. I made some good cornmeal gruel, and I fed Aunt Abby a teaspoon every little while all night long. In the morning, I sent for the doctor. When the doctor had gone, Luella came into the room looking like a baby in her ruffled nightgown, and she looked at Aunt Abby in the bed sort of innocent and surprised. "Why?" says she. "Aunt Abby ain't got up yet?" "No, she ain't," says I. "I thought I didn't smell the coffee," says Luella. "Coffee?" says I. "I guess if you have coffee this morning, you'll make it yourself." "I never made the coffee in all my life," says she, dreadful astonished. I was getting madder and madder. There was something about that little pink and white thing standing there and talking about coffee when she had killed so many better folks than she was. "Is Aunt Abby sick?" says Luella, as if she was sort of aggrieved and injured. "Yes," says I, "she's sick and she's going to die, and then you'll be left alone and you'll have to do for yourself." Well, Luella, she up and had hysterics at that, and I just let her have 'em. The doctor, he came, and Mrs. Sam Abbott, but when she got there, it was too late. Her mother was dead. Aunt Abby's daughter just gave one look at her mother laying there, then she looked at me. "Where is she?" says she, and I knew she meant Luella. "She's out in the kitchen," says I. "She's too nervous to see folks die." The doctor, he speaks up then. He was a young man. "Mrs. Miller is not strong," says he, kind of severe, "and she is quite right in not agitating herself." "You are another young man. She's got her pretty claw on you," thinks I, but I didn't say anything to him. Mrs. Sam Abbott, she went out there, and I never heard anything like the way she talked to Luella Miller. I guess the truth was most too much for her and no mistake, because Luella presently actually did faint away, and the doctor, he came running out, and he said something about a weak heart, dreadful fierce to Mrs. Sam Abbott. "Weak heart," says she, "weak heart, weak fiddlesticks." But the doctor, he was bending over Luella, laying there with her pretty pink and white face all pale and her blue eyes like stars gone out, and he was holding onto her hand and smoothing her forehead, and I sort of pitied the poor young doctor, and I made up my mind I'd see what I could do. I waited till the doctor was going to see Luella steady, and folks were beginning to talk. Then one evening, when I knew the doctor had been called out of town, I went over to Luella's. "I don't know what there is about you," says I. "You kill everybody that is fool enough to care anything about you and do for you." She stared at me, and she was pretty pale. Says I, "You're going to kill Dr. Malcolm before you're done with him." Then a red color came flaming all over her face. "I ain't going to kill him either," says she, and she begun to cry. "Yes, you be," says I. Then I spoke as I had never spoke before. I told her that she was a dreadful woman, and she was. That's true enough, but sometimes I have wondered lately if she knew it. If she went like a baby with scissors in its hand, cutting everybody without knowing what it was doing. Luella, she kept getting paler and paler. There was something awful about the way she looked at me and never spoke one word. After a while, I quit talking and I went home. I watched that night, but her lamp went out before 9 o'clock, and when Dr. Malcolm came driving past and sort of slowed up, he see there wasn't any light, and he drove along. I saw her sort of shy out a meeting the next Sunday, too, so he shouldn't go home with her, and I begun to think maybe she did have some conscience after all. She acted sort of offish to the doctor, and he didn't go there, and there wasn't anybody to do anything for her. I don't know how she did get along. But it wasn't very long before folks began to say that Luella herself was going into a decline. I used to see her going past from the store with a bundle as if she could hardly crawl. But I remembered how Erastus used to wait and tend when he couldn't hardly put one foot before the other, and I didn't go out to help her. But at last, one afternoon, I saw the doctor come driving up like mad with his medicine chest, and Mrs. Babbitt came in after supper and said that Luella was real sick. But the next morning, I see her at the window. And pretty soon she came stepping out as spry as you please. And a little while afterward, Mrs. Babbitt said she was pretty sure that the doctor was going to marry Luella. Well, everybody knew that Luella and the doctor were going to be married, but it wasn't long before they began to talk about his looking so poorly, just as they had about the others. Well, the doctor did die, and he wanted to be married first, so as to leave what little he had to Luella. But he died before the minister could get there. Well, that wound everything up for Luella Miller. Not another soul in the whole town would lift a finger for her. I stood it as long as I could, but one day I see her coming with her arms full and stopping to lean against the Babbitt fence, and I run out and took her bundles and carried them to her house. Then I went home and never spoke one word to her, though she called after me dreadful kind of pitiful. Well, that night I was taken sick with a chill, and I was sick as I wanted to be for 2 weeks. Mrs. Babbitt had seen me run out to help Luella, and she came in and told me I was going to die on account of it. I didn't know whether I was or not, but I considered I had done right by Erastus's wife. That last 2 weeks, Luella, she had a dreadful hard time, I guess. She was pretty sick, and as near as I could make out, nobody dared go near her. I don't know if she was really needing anything very much, for there was enough to eat in her house, but I guess she had a hard time, she that had been so petted and done for all her life. When I got so I could go out, I went over there one morning. I got right up, though I hadn't been out of the house for 2 weeks, and I went in there. And Luella, she was laying on the bed, and she was dying. Nobody else dared to go there. It was about midnight that I left her for a minute to run home and get some medicine I'd been taking, for I begun to feel rather bad. It was a full moon that night, and just as I started out of my door to cross the street back to Luella's, I stopped short, for I saw something. I saw what I saw, and I know I saw it, and I will swear on my deathbed that I saw it. I saw Luella Miller and Erastus Miller and Lily and Aunt Abby and the doctor all going out of her door, and all but Luella shone white in the moonlight, and they were all helping her along till she seemed to fairly fly in the midst of them. Then it all disappeared. I stood a minute with my heart pounding, then I went over there. I thought of going for Mrs. Babbitt, but I thought she'd be afraid. So I went alone, though I knew what had happened. Luella was laying, real peaceful, dead on her bed. Come back one last time tomorrow, and I will introduce you to Clarimonde. Sleep well, if you can.